Hi, this is Margaret Byrd and welcome to Color Quest. For the past 2 years, I was lucky enough to work with the Color Farm, a natural dye plant farm near my home here in Washington. I've had several videos over these last 2 years working out on the farm and with the different dye plants they were growing. And last year became a part of their community-supported agriculture program. And by doing this, I got 4 incredible boxes each month last summer and fall of their local plants that they were growing and some special things inside. The CSA program afforded the opportunity for people to receive some of these natural dye plants in a kitted form and have everything they needed to make a project at home. The next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at the last 3 boxes of 2022 and working through those kits and seeing what beauty we can make in the dye pot. So this week, we'll be looking at Marigold. Let's get that kit open and see what gorgeous colors await. If you go back to the Indigo library here at Color Quest, you'll see the video where I was the artist who worked with fresh leaf indigo to dye wool skeins. We had a whole video about that process and the beautiful results, and they were quite varied. Fresh leaf indigo is so very special, and I was honored to have an opportunity to work on that. The first box we'll be looking at is from the month of August, where I was in fact that artist, and the flower that was in full bloom at that time, which was harvested included in the kit that came with my fresh leaf indigo dyed skein, was Marigold. So we get to work on a Marigold project today. Let's open up that kit and see what's inside. This was the second kit that we got last year. This was for the month of August, and each one of these kits we get a letter talking about what is going on at the farm, as well as a highlight of the artist, and I happen to be the artist from August of last year. I worked on using fresh leaf indigo, which in this particular kit is one of the skeins of wool that I worked on, and actually there was a video here of all of those different skeins that I did for the Color Farm. Then we also get a secondary skein of beautiful wool yarn, and that is because in each one of these boxes we have a secondary featured flower that was growing and harvested at the time from the Color Farm. So this is Marigold, and they had a beautiful garden filled with Marigold. So this will be what we are going to use to dye this skein of wool. They also give us wonderful instructions on how to do the 3 steps, which is scouring, mordanting, and dyeing specifically to the Marigold. And then we're given 2 sweet little tags to add to the wool itself. This would be the wool that I dyed, the fresh leaf indigo, as well as a tag for the Marigold to tag our wool once it's done. And yes, they do. They include a bag of aluminum potassium sulfate, or alum, which we're going to use for the Mordant process. So let's pull out our instructions and we will follow along to walk through the steps. I know you know this, but it's nice to have this all kitted. And to take it one step further and work with you on something to expand your palette, I'm going to take part of this skein that's dyed with fresh leaf indigo, and I'm going to over dye it with the Marigold. So we will get a new color, and overdying is a fantastic way to just welcome more color into your natural palette. Right, here's my skein. I didn't make a very big one because, to be honest with you, I really want to be able to keep as much of this fresh leaf indigo dyed wool. It was a lot of work, and so it's kind of precious. So I've only cut off about this much, rolled a tiny skein, and I'll use this to also dye in the Marigold and see what kind of an overdye it produces. So you've seen these instructions from the Color Farm on a few other videos, so I won't go too deep into them, but basically they show us the 3 steps that are really important in all dyeing, and the first one being scouring. Now, what they're doing here is simply using a tiny drop of neutral detergent or dish soap, and you've seen me do that as well here on Color Quest many times. This wool, I believe they know, is pretty clean, so gentle dish soap should be sufficient. It is just going to go on our stove top, and we will make sure it doesn't get too hot. They're like keeping it under 160, so for me that's just barely a simmer, and we'll just let that sort of float around in that water for about 30 minutes. We do need to be cautious in shifting temperatures when we're working with wool. We don't want to have the chance that it's going to felt, so we just don't want to shock it with some extreme temperature changes. So we'll get that on the stovetop and working now. And since this wool has already been washed and dyed, I'm going to put it into water now just to wet it so it can go into the Mordant bath. I am going to go ahead and throw this in a Mordant because we didn't have to Mordant with the indigo. That's not required. So this yarn itself hasn't been Mordanted, so I figured we might as well plop it into the alum bath just to give it that extra binding power. So we'll let this soak while we wash the other fiber. So while the wool is washing or scouring, let's look at the Mordant instructions. They've supplied the alum packet. We're going to dissolve the Mordant in a little boiling water and stir until fully dissolved. I typically just heat up water in my microwave to make it hot so that we can dissolve the alum. We'll do that. And then the next step will be putting it right back into that dye pot with new fresh water, and we're going to be simmering that. So first let's get that alum dissolved. One thing that's really nice about a kit is that everything's measured for you. So we can see here that we've got 100 grams of the merino wool and a packet of alum for the Mordant. Now, typically you work with about 15% weight of fiber. So if we have 100 grams of wool, then this should be around 15 grams. So I figured we'd just weigh it and see. It comes in at 17. We've got a bag as well, which has some tear weight. So yeah, we have it all nice and measured out, but you can see there that we're between 15 and 17% of weight of fiber for the alum, which is pretty standard stuff for alum Mordant. So dyeing instructions are pretty standard. We're gonna fill our pot, we're gonna add the dried marigolds, and we're gonna bring it to a boil. Now, I rarely, if ever, bring anything to a boil, so I'm just going to bring it to a nice simmer, and I'm gonna let it hold at that temperature for about an hour. And then we're gonna remove the flowers, as they are quite small bits, and this can get caught up in wool. So I don't always remove it if I'm putting full pieces of fabric in, but with wool yarn, it just will get in the way. So if you don't want to remove them, you can also put them into a nut milk bag or something like muslin, and you can just dangle that in the dye pot. That is an option. I did that with lobster mushroom here recently, so you can see what that's all about. It's a great way if you don't want to have to make the dye, then remove the dyed matter, and then put the textile in. In this case, we're going to do it since we're doing all of this while we're doing our pre-treatment with Mordant. And then we're going to put it in and hold it for about 30 to 60 minutes. I like to always go about 60, and I'm definitely going to let it cool in the pot. That is a great way to allow the dye to have more time to settle in on the yarn. So we'll rinse the yarn afterwards and hang it to dry. So pretty typical steps for dye flowers. So we'll go ahead and get that going. Now, again, one of the nice things about a kit is that everything's been measured for you. So we have this awesome bag of marigolds, and we can assume that enough was given to us to dye 100 grams of wool. So there's about 35 grams here. Marigold's pretty strong in the dye realm, so you can assume that 35 grams is enough to dye 100 grams of wool. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio by any stretch. So let's open it up and get the dye going. Now we're going to be using pieces including the stem portion and where the petals go in. I'm not going to worry about that. And they're all nice and dried. They look great. Exciting to use these. So as you know, green is really hard to come by in natural dyes. And one of the ways in which it is made often is by doing an overdye process. So having the ability to take that skein or part of that skein of the fresh leaf indigo and over dye it with the marigold created that beautiful green. So keep that in your recipe box as one way that you can achieve green. As a matter of fact, last year we had a video here where I took a wool shirt. I used dyer's chamomile, which was grown at the color farm, and then over dyed it with black hollyhock, which produced a beautiful green as well. So you can go back and check out that video if you want to watch that process. But in general, over dyeing is just something that you can use as another way to expand your color palette. So don't forget about it. Marigold is a fan favorite in the dyer's world for bringing about these beautiful deep yellow colors. And during certain times of the year, they are in full harvest. So if you are in an area that has them growing now, be sure to snip some of those flowers and use them in your dye pot at some point. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we see marigolds growing in the late summer. And in places like Mexico, they are used in all kinds of beautiful traditions in and around late October and early November. They are also widely used in India as a dye flower and something for different types of traditional ceremonies. It is an incredible dye flower. I love seeing the green of the overdye next to the yellow and knowing that this incredible kit allowed me to do just that. And of course, working with wool is always fantastic as a fiber. It really loves natural dyes. So I understand why this wool yarn is part of the Color Farms kit. You will not be disappointed when you work with protein fibers like wool and silk and natural color. Okay, next week on Color Quest, we're going to look at the next kitted box from the Color Farm, and that is for the month of September. And another flourishing dye flower here in the Pacific Northwest at that time of year is the sulfur cosmos. So I hope to see you next week and see what the Color Farm has in store for us inside of our dye pot. If you are enjoying yourself here at Color Quest, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so. Share the good word about Color Quest. You know that once you start with natural dyes, you are going to get hooked, and the more the merrier. I will see you next Friday on Color Quest. To over dye on that, I was then, and then, I don't know, and I don't remember. I don't remember what I did. Let me look it up.